What would you do if your 6-year-old daughter was dying and the medicine that could save her life cost more than your house? Margaret. Chen thought she knew desperation until she met 85 leather-clad bikers who were about to turn her quiet suburban nightmare into a constitutional battle that would change American healthcare forever. This isn't just another heartwarming story about kindness. This is about what happens when ordinary people discover that sometimes the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed to keep you out. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Chen had always been the kind of mother who kept meticulous records. Every doctor's appointment, every prescription, every insurance claim was filed away in color-coded folders in her home office. She believed that an organization could solve most problems, that if you just followed the rules and kept good records, the system would work for you. That belief shattered on a Tuesday morning in March when Dr. Patricia Henley delivered the words that would upend everything Margaret thought she knew about fairness, justice, and the American dream. Your daughter has Hutchinson-Gilford progeria syndrome, Dr. Henley said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the weight of what she was about to explain. It's an extremely rare genetic condition that causes rapid aging in children. Margaret's 6-year-old daughter, Emma, sat on the examination table, swinging her small legs and humming softly to herself, completely unaware that her mother's world was collapsing. Emma had always been smaller than other children her age, but Margaret had attributed it to genetics. She herself had been a late bloomer. The hair loss that had started 3 months ago, the joint stiffness, the way Emma sometimes moved like an old woman. Margaret had convinced herself these were temporary setbacks, nothing that couldn't be fixed with the right vitamins or a change in diet. How rare? Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. 1 in 20 million births. There are fewer than 400 known cases worldwide. Dr. Henley pulled up a chair, the kind of gesture that doctors make when they're about to deliver news that requires sitting down. But there's something you need to understand about this condition, Mrs. Chen. Without treatment, children with progeria typically live to about 14 years old. The room seemed to tilt. Margaret gripped the sides of her chair, feeling as though she might slide right off the world. Emma continued humming, picking at a loose thread on her sweater. The same purple sweater that had fit perfectly just 6 months ago and now hung loose on her shrinking frame. What kind of treatment? Margaret's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. There's a medication called lonafarnib. It's not a cure, but it can significantly slow the progression of the disease. Studies show it can add 2 to 3 years to a child's life, and more importantly, it can dramatically improve quality of life during those years. 2 to 3 years. Margaret tried to process what that meant. Emma was 6. Even with the medication, she might not live to see her 10th birthday. Without it, how do we get this medication? Dr. Henley's pause lasted just a moment too long. That's where things become complicated. Lonafarnib is manufactured by only one pharmaceutical company, Helix Therapeutics. The annual cost is approximately $450,000. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. $450,000. She and her husband, David, made a combined income of $68,000 a year. They lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in Riverside, California, that they'd bought for $230,000 with a 30-year mortgage. $450,000 wasn't just more money than they had, it was more money than they would ever have. Insurance will cover it, right? The question came out desperate, pleading. Dr. Henley's expression told Margaret everything she needed to know before the words came. Your insurance company, Pacific Health Partners, has already indicated they consider lonafarnib experimental for progeria treatment. They've denied coverage, but you just said it adds years to her life. How is that experimental? The FDA approved lonafarnib for progeria in 2020, but many insurance companies still classify it as investigational. They argue that because progeria is so rare, there isn't enough long-term data to justify the cost. Margaret stared at her daughter, who had stopped humming and was now looking back and forth between the adults with growing concern. At 6 years old, Emma couldn't understand the medical terminology, but she could sense the tension in the room, the way her mother's hands were shaking. So, what are our options? You can appeal the insurance decision. Sometimes that works, though it can take months. You could apply for compassionate use programs through Helix Therapeutics, but there's a waiting list and strict eligibility requirements. There are some non-profit organizations that help families with rare disease medications, but their funding is limited. Margaret nodded mechanically, but inside she was calculating. Months of appeals, while Emma continued to age at 8 times the normal rate. Waiting lists for a child who might not have time to wait. Non-profit organizations with limited funding competing against desperate families just like hers. What happens if we can't get the medication? Dr. Henley looked down at her hands. Emma's condition will progress. She'll experience more joint problems, cardiovascular issues, and other complications associated with accelerated aging. We'll do everything we can to manage her symptoms and keep her comfortable, but she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a calculator, a stack of bills, and Emma's medical records spread out before her. David was upstairs, reading Emma her bedtime story, something about a princess who could turn invisible whenever she wanted to hide from scary things. Margaret wished invisibility was an option for her right now. The numbers were unforgiving. Even if they sold their house, cashed out David's small 401k, and borrowed against everything they owned, they might scrape together $50,000. It wouldn't even cover 2 months of Emma's medication. Margaret had grown up believing that America was a place where hard work was rewarded, where if you played by the rules and did the right things, the system would take care of you. She had a college degree in accounting. David was a skilled electrician. They paid their taxes, voted in every election, and had never asked for anything from anyone. They were exactly the kind of people the American dream was supposed to work for. But as she stared at the impossible mathematics of her daughter's survival, Margaret began to understand something that would fundamentally change how she saw the world. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. And she and Emma weren't part of the design. The next morning, Margaret called Pacific Health Partners and spent 4 hours on hold, transferred between departments, speaking to representatives who expressed sympathy but offered no solutions. The appeals process would take a minimum of 60 days. The compassionate use program had a 6-month waiting list. The pharmaceutical company's patient assistance program was available only to families earning less than $30,000 annually. Too little to survive on. But apparently, the threshold for deserving life-saving medication. Margaret hung up the phone and looked out her kitchen window at the suburban street where she'd imagined Emma would grow up, riding bicycles and going to school dances and eventually graduating from college. The normalcy of it all, neighbors walking their dogs, mail carriers making their rounds, children playing in front yards, seemed suddenly surreal. How many of these people knew that in America, a child could have a death sentence not because medicine didn't exist to help her, but because her parents couldn't afford it? How many of them understood that all their careful planning and responsible choices meant nothing when faced with the arbitrary cruelty of a system that put profit margins ahead of 6-year-old girls? Margaret Chen had been raised to believe that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that good people solved their own problems. But as she watched Emma through the window, playing alone in their backyard because she tired too easily to keep up with other children, Margaret realized that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She just had no idea that help would come from the last place she ever expected to find it: Margaret. Chen had never considered herself the type of person who would create a GoFundMe page. She had always quietly judged people who aired their personal struggles online, believing there was something undignified about asking strangers for money. But dignity, she was learning, was another luxury that disappeared when your child was dying. The campaign she launched was titled Help Emma Fight Progeria, with a photo of Emma grinning gap-toothed at the camera, holding a stuffed elephant that was nearly as big as she was. Margaret spent hours crafting the description, trying to strike the right balance between heart-wrenching and hopeful, desperate but not pathetic. Within the first week, the campaign raised $1,200. Margaret refreshed the page obsessively, watching the small donations trickle in: $20 from a former co-worker, $50 from her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, $10 from someone named Jake Morrison, with a message that simply said, "Hang in there." Each donation felt like a small miracle and a crushing reminder of how impossibly far they had to go. David had taken on every available overtime shift at the electrical company, working 16-hour days that left him exhausted and hollow-eyed. Margaret had started selling everything they owned that wasn't nailed down: jewelry, furniture, David's vintage guitar collection, even Emma's unused toys from when she'd been healthy enough to play with them. Every sacrifice felt both necessary and utterly insufficient. The worst part wasn't the financial stress or the exhaustion. It was watching Emma pretend not to notice what was happening around her. She had stopped asking why Daddy was never home anymore, why they were eating cereal for dinner, why strangers on the internet were looking at her picture. At 6 years old, Emma was developing the kind of emotional intelligence that comes from living in a house where the adults are barely holding themselves together. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 weeks into their fundraising efforts, Margaret received a message through the GoFundMe platform that made her stomach drop. It was from a woman named Sarah Kellerman in Phoenix, Arizona. "I saw your campaign for Emma. My son had progeria too. His name was Michael. I wanted you to know that we tried everything. GoFundMe, grants, even remortgaged our house twice. We raised almost $60,000 over 2 years. It wasn't enough. Michael passed away last year. He was 9. I'm not telling you this to be cruel. I'm telling you because someone needs to say what no one else will. The system is designed to let our children die. The pharmaceutical company knows exactly what they're doing when they price medication at $500,000 a year. They're counting on most families giving up." "I'm sorry, Margaret. I wish I had better news." Margaret stared at the message for 20 minutes before closing her laptop. She walked to Emma's room, where her daughter was napping, something that happened more frequently now as the disease progressed. Emma looked so small in her bed, her face gaunt but peaceful, her breathing steady and soft. Margaret sat in the chair beside the bed, the same chair where she'd read thousands of bedtime stories, and tried to imagine a world where this room would be empty. Sarah Kellerman's message had confirmed what Margaret had been afraid to acknowledge. They weren't going to raise $450,000 on GoFundMe. Even if every person in their town of 30,000 donated $20, it wouldn't be enough. Even if the campaign went viral and reached millions of people, the mathematics of crowd-funded medical care were brutal and unforgiving. That evening, Margaret made a decision that would have horrified her 6 months earlier. She began researching medical tourism, specifically traveling to countries where lonafarnib might be available at a fraction of the cost. India had generic versions of some rare disease medications. Mexico had different approval processes that sometimes made experimental treatments accessible. Canada's healthcare system occasionally covered medications that American insurance companies rejected. The research consumed her. She spent entire nights reading medical forums, patient advocacy websites, and pharmaceutical regulatory documents in 3 different languages. She contacted patient advocacy organizations in 12 countries, composed emails to researchers at universities she'd never heard of, and even reached out to pharmaceutical companies in developing nations to inquire about compassionate use programs. Most of her inquiries went unanswered. The responses she did receive were polite but devastating. Lonafarnib was manufactured by only one company, under strict patent protections that prevented generic alternatives. The medication required specialized handling and monitoring that wasn't available in most countries. Even in places where it might theoretically be accessible, the cost was still prohibitive for a middle-class American family with no international connections. Dr. Henley had warned Margaret about this phase, the desperate research, the impossible schemes, the gradual realization that love and determination weren't enough to overcome corporate greed and systemic indifference. She called it the bargaining stage and said that most families went through it before accepting the reality of their situation. But Margaret wasn't ready to accept reality. She expanded her search beyond traditional medical channels, diving into online communities where parents shared information about experimental treatments, off-label medication users, and underground networks of people who had found ways to access life-saving drugs outside the normal system. It was in one of these communities that Margaret first encountered the phrase that would change everything: medical necessity activism. The concept was simple but radical. If the legal system wouldn't provide access to life-saving medication, and if the medical system wouldn't challenge pharmaceutical pricing, then people would have to create their own pressure. Medical necessity activism involved everything from peaceful protests outside pharmaceutical company headquarters to more aggressive tactics like publicity campaigns that embarrassed companies into providing compassionate care. Margaret found herself reading about a group in Texas that had organized a die-in outside the offices of an insulin manufacturer, with diabetic patients literally lying on the ground to demonstrate what would happen without access to affordable medication. She read about parents in Oregon who had chained themselves to the doors of an insurance company that was denying coverage for their children's cancer treatments. She discovered networks of people who pooled resources to buy medications in bulk, distributed information about patient assistance programs, and sometimes engaged in more legally questionable activities to ensure access to care. For the first time since Emma's diagnosis, Margaret felt something other than helplessness. She felt anger, clean, focused, and potentially useful anger. The turning point came during Emma's follow-up appointment 6 weeks after the initial diagnosis. Dr. Henley ran the same battery of tests, took the same measurements, and delivered news that Margaret had been dreading but expecting. Emma's condition is progressing faster than we initially projected, Dr. Henley explained. Her cardiovascular system is showing signs of strain, and her joint mobility has decreased significantly. Without treatment, I would estimate that she has perhaps 18 months, maybe 2 years. 18 months. Margaret did the math automatically, a skill that had become second nature. Even if they could somehow raise the money for 1 year of treatment, they would need nearly $500,000 every single year for the rest of Emma's life. They weren't trying to buy a cure. They were trying to rent time, one impossibly expensive month at a time. "Doctor," Margaret said slowly, "what would happen if someone just took the medication? Hypothetically, if someone found a way to get lonafarnib without going through insurance or the official channels." Dr. Henley's expression became very careful. Hypothetically, lonafarnib is a controlled substance that requires precise dosing and regular monitoring. Taking it without medical supervision would be dangerous and potentially fatal, and obtaining it without proper authorization would be illegal. But if someone had medical supervision, if they found a way to get the medication but still worked with doctors for monitoring. "Mrs. Chen, I understand your frustration, but I can't advise you to pursue illegal options. What I can tell you is that some families have found success working with patient advocacy groups that specialize in rare diseases. There's one group in particular that has been very effective at pressuring pharmaceutical companies to provide compassionate care. They're based in California, not far from here. What's the group called? They call themselves the Constitutional Health Alliance. They take a very aggressive approach to healthcare advocacy. Some people find their methods controversial, but they've had remarkable success getting companies to provide free or reduced-cost medications to families who can't afford them. Margaret wrote down the name. though she had no idea that this single piece of information would lead her to 85 leather-clad bikers who were about to turn her quiet suburban nightmare into a constitutional battle that would change her understanding of justice, community, and what it meant to be American. That night, Margaret searched for the Constitutional Health Alliance online and found exactly what she expected: a website full of legal language, policy papers, and testimonials from grateful families. What she didn't expect was the phone number that appeared at the bottom of their contact page, with a note that said, "For immediate assistance with life-threatening medication access issues, call directly. Someone will answer." Margaret stared at her phone for 10 minutes before dialing. She had no idea that the voice that answered would belong to a man named Thomas Thunder Rodriguez, who rode a 1200cc Harley-Davidson and had spent the last 15 years of his life making pharmaceutical executives very uncomfortable. The voice that answered the Constitutional Health Alliance phone number was not what Margaret had expected. Deep, gravelly, with the kind of authority that came from decades of being listened to when he spoke. Thomas Thunder Rodriguez sounded more like someone who should be running a construction crew than a healthcare advocacy organization. Constitutional Health Alliance, Thunder speaking. "What's your emergency?" Margaret had rehearsed what she would say, but the directness of the question caught her off guard. My daughter has progeria. She needs medication that costs $450,000 a year, and our insurance won't cover it. How old is your daughter?" 6. There was a pause. Margaret could hear the sound of motorcycles in the background, voices calling back and forth, the metallic clang of tools. "Oh, what's your name?" "Margaret Chen. We live in Riverside." "Margaret, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you willing to do whatever it takes to save your daughter's life?" The question should have been easy to answer, but something in Thunder's tone made Margaret realize he wasn't talking about fundraising or filling out forms. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you willing to challenge a system that values corporate profits over the life of a 6-year-old girl? Are you prepared to make some very wealthy, very powerful people extremely uncomfortable? Because that's what it's going to take." Margaret thought about Emma, about Sarah Kellerman's son Michael, who had died at 9, about all the other children who would continue to die because their parents couldn't afford to keep them alive. "Yes, I'm willing." "Good. Meet me tomorrow at Danny's Diner on Magnolia Avenue at 2 o'clock. Come alone. We'll talk about what comes next." The line went dead before Margaret could ask any of the dozen questions that immediately came to mind. She spent the rest of the evening researching the Constitutional Health Alliance more thoroughly, trying to understand what she had gotten herself into. The organization's official website was professional and conventional. Policy papers about healthcare access, testimonials from grateful families, legal briefs about pharmaceutical pricing. But deeper searches revealed a more complex picture. The Constitutional Health Alliance had been founded in 2018 by a coalition of motorcycle clubs throughout California, Nevada, and Arizona. Their approach to healthcare advocacy was unlike anything Margaret had ever encountered. Instead of polite lobbying or quiet negotiations with insurance companies, they engaged in what they called constitutional pressure campaigns, highly visible, legally sophisticated actions designed to force pharmaceutical companies to provide medications at affordable prices. Their track record was remarkable and slightly terrifying. In 2019, they had surrounded the headquarters of a company that manufactured insulin, with over 200 bikers maintaining a continuous presence until the company agreed to provide free insulin to any diabetic who couldn't afford it. In 2021, they had organized a convoy that followed the CEO of a cancer drug manufacturer to every public appearance for 6 months, always staying exactly within legal boundaries but making it impossible for him to ignore the families who were dying because of his pricing decisions. The alliance operated in a legal gray area that Margaret didn't fully understand. They never broke laws, but they pushed every boundary of what constituted acceptable protest. They had lawyers, constitutional scholars, and media specialists among their members. They were simultaneously a motorcycle club and a think tank, a protest organization and a legal advocacy group. Margaret arrived at Danny's diner 15 minutes early, her stomach churning with anxiety and anticipation. She had no idea what Thunder looked like, but when the door opened at exactly 2 o'clock, there was no question about his identity. Thomas Rodriguez was probably in his late 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a ponytail and arms that were completely covered in tattoos. He wore a leather vest over a plain black t-shirt, with patches that indicated his rank in what Margaret was beginning to understand was a highly organized hierarchy. But what struck her most wasn't his appearance, it was his eyes. They were intelligent, focused, and completely without the kind of performative toughness that Margaret had expected from a biker. Margaret, she nodded, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look in her conservative business attire. Relax, Thunder said, sliding into the booth across from her. I know this isn't what you expected. Most people think we're going to be drinking beer and talking about how much we hate the government. The reality is more complicated. A waitress appeared with coffee, clearly familiar with Thunder and completely unfazed by his appearance. Margaret realized this was probably a regular meeting spot for him. Tell me about Emma, Thunder said. For the next 20 minutes, Margaret found herself telling a complete stranger things she hadn't been able to say to her own family. She talked about watching Emma struggle to open jars that she used to handle easily, about the way her daughter had stopped asking when she would feel better, about the crushing realization that love and determination weren't enough to save her child. Thunder listened without interrupting, occasionally asking specific questions about Emma's treatment needs, their insurance situation, and their financial resources. His questions were precise and informed. He clearly understood the medical and legal complexities of rare disease treatment, better than Margaret would have thought possible. Here's what you need to understand, Thunder finally said. The pharmaceutical industry has turned healthcare into a protection racket. They develop medications using taxpayer-funded research, patent them to prevent competition, and then charge whatever the market will bear. When people can't afford their products, they die. It's not an accident or an oversight, it's the business model. But surely there must be some kind of oversight, some way to challenge the pricing. Thunder's laugh was bitter. The same government agencies that approve these drugs are staffed by former pharmaceutical executives. The insurance companies that deny coverage invest heavily in the same companies that manufacture the medications. It's not a broken system, Margaret. It's a perfectly functional system that wasn't designed to help people like Emma. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. So what do? We make it more expensive for them to let Emma die than it would be to keep her alive. Before Margaret could ask what that meant, Thunder continued. Helix Therapeutics, the company that makes lonafarnib, had revenue of $3.8 billion last year. They spent more money on executive bonuses than they did on research and development. The CEO, a man named Richard Blackstone, makes $47 million annually. The medication that Emma needs represents about 0.01% of their total revenue. I don't understand how that helps us. It helps because it means they can afford to give Emma her medication for free, without affecting their bottom line in any meaningful way. The only reason they don't is because they're afraid of setting a precedent. If they provide free medication to one family, other families might expect the same consideration. Thunder pulled out his phone and showed Margaret a series of photographs. The first was a massive house with gates, a circular driveway, and what looked like a private golf course. This is Richard Blackstone's primary residence in San Diego, 43,000 square feet. He also has homes in Aspen, the Hamptons, and a private island in the Caribbean. The next photo showed a yacht that looked more like a small cruise ship. This is his boat. It's called Molecular Magic. He bought it for $85 million last year, enough money to provide free lonafarnib to almost 200 children like Emma. Margaret stared at the images, feeling her anger building that was different from anything she had experienced before. This wasn't the helpless rage she had felt at insurance company bureaucrats or the desperate frustration of dealing with medical billing departments. This was something sharper and more focused. "What are you suggesting we do?" Thunder's expression became very serious. "I'm suggesting we help Mr. Blackstone understand that his current business practices are creating a public relations problem that could become very expensive to manage. We're going to make him an offer he can't refuse, not because we're threatening him, but because we're going to demonstrate exactly what it looks like when 85 law-abiding American citizens exercise their constitutional right to peaceful protest." 85. The Constitutional Health Alliance has 85 active members across 3 states. We're veterans, business owners, teachers, mechanics, lawyers, and retirees. We ride motorcycles, and we believe that access to life-saving medication is a constitutional right. When we decide to support a family, we don't do it halfway. Margaret tried to imagine what 85 motorcycles would look like parked outside a pharmaceutical company's headquarters. What kind of attention that would generate, what kind of pressure it would create. Is this legal? Completely legal. Peaceful assembly, freedom of speech, and the right to petition for redress of grievances are all protected by the First Amendment. We have lawyers who specialize in constitutional law, and we've never been successfully prosecuted for anything we've done because we're very careful to stay within legal boundaries. Thunder leaned forward, his voice becoming even more serious. "But I need you to understand what you're signing up for. This isn't going to be quiet or polite. We're going to make noise, attract media attention, and probably make some very powerful people angry. Your name is going to be in newspapers. Your story is going to be on television. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret thought about Emma, sleeping peacefully at home while her body continued its relentless march toward an early death. She thought about Sarah Kellerman's son Michael and all the other children who had died quietly, politely, without making any noise or causing any trouble for the people who could have saved them. "When do we start?" Margaret had expected the Constitutional Health Alliance to meet in some kind of motorcycle clubhouse, dark, smoky, filled with pool tables and beer signs. Instead, Thunder directed her to a modern office building in downtown San Bernardino, where the Alliance occupied the entire 3rd floor of what looked like any other professional complex. The space was a revelation. One wall was covered with legal documents, constitutional amendments printed in large format, and Supreme Court decisions related to healthcare access and peaceful assembly. Another wall displayed a massive organizational chart showing pharmaceutical companies, their executives, board members, and financial relationships with insurance companies and government agencies. It looked like something from a federal investigation. "Welcome to the war room," said a woman who appeared to be in her early 40s, extending her hand to Margaret. "I'm Jessica Brennan, the Alliance's legal counsel. Thunder tells me you're ready to challenge Helix Therapeutics." Jessica looked nothing like what Margaret had imagined when she thought of a biker lawyer. She wore a perfectly tailored business suit, her dark hair pulled back in a professional chignon, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from winning cases that other people thought were unwinnable. "Jessica used to work for the Department of Justice," Thunder explained. "Corporate Fraud Division. She spent 8 years investigating pharmaceutical companies before she decided she could do more good working with us." The next hour was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. What she had assumed would be a planning meeting for some kind of protest turned out to be a sophisticated briefing on constitutional law, media strategy, and corporate pressure tactics. The First Amendment guarantees our right to peaceful assembly and petition for redress of grievances, Jessica explained, pointing to a flowchart that mapped out various legal precedents. "But the key to our effectiveness isn't just that we stay within legal boundaries. It's that we understand exactly how corporate decision-making works. She pulled up a presentation on a large screen that showed Helix Therapeutics' corporate structure, stock price history, and upcoming board meetings. Richard Blackstone answers to shareholders and board members. His primary concern isn't helping sick children, it's maintaining stock prices and avoiding negative publicity that could affect quarterly earnings. Margaret found herself taking notes as Jessica outlined a strategy that was far more complex than simple protest. The Constitutional Health Alliance had researched every aspect of Helix Therapeutics' business operations, identified key decision-makers, and developed a multi-pronged approach designed to make providing Emma's medication the path of least resistance. "We don't just show up with motorcycles and signs," Jessica continued. "We coordinate media appearances, file legal briefs challenging their pricing practices, and organize investors to ask uncomfortable questions at shareholder meetings. The motorcycles are just the most visible part of what we do." Thunder introduced Margaret to other alliance members who had arrived during the briefing. There was Maria Santos, a retired Marine who now worked as a financial analyst and specialized in researching pharmaceutical company economics. Robert Diesel Murphy, a former aerospace engineer who had become an expert on FDA approval processes and patent law. Carmen Rodriguez, Thunder's sister and a former investigative journalist who now handled the Alliance's media strategy. Each member had a story about why they had joined the Alliance. Maria's grandson had needed a rare cancer treatment that insurance had initially denied. Diesel's wife had died because they couldn't afford a medication that cost $12,000 per month. Carmen had watched her elderly mother ration insulin because Medicare didn't fully cover the costs. "We're not anti-business or anti-pharmaceutical," Thunder explained as the group gathered around a conference table. "We're pro-constitutional rights. These companies have the right to make profits, but they don't have the right to price medications so high that American citizens die from treatable conditions." Margaret learned that the Alliance maintained detailed files on dozens of pharmaceutical companies, tracking their pricing practices, executive compensation, and responses to public pressure. They had successfully negotiated reduced cost or free medications for over 300 families in the past 5 years. "How do you get companies to agree to provide free medication?" Margaret asked. Jessica smiled grimly. "We make them understand that the cost of saying no is higher than the cost of saying yes. Negative publicity, investor concerns, regulatory scrutiny, and sustained public pressure can cost a company millions in lost stock value. Providing free medication to one family costs them essentially nothing, but it makes the problem go away." Carmen pulled out a folder thick with newspaper clippings, television transcripts, and social media screenshots. "When we supported the Harrison family in Nevada, their story was covered by CNN, Fox News, the Los Angeles Times, and went viral on social media. Helix's stock price dropped 12% in 3 days. The company's board of directors received over 40,000 emails from angry shareholders. It took them less than a week to approve compassionate use of lonafarnib for the Harrison's daughter." Margaret felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. The Alliance clearly had the expertise and resources to pressure Helix Therapeutics, but the scale of what they were proposing was overwhelming. "What exactly would happen if I agreed to work with you?" Thunder leaned back in his chair. "First, we file a formal petition with Helix requesting compassionate use of lonafarnib for Emma. We'll give them 2 weeks to respond. When they deny the request, and they will deny it, we implement what we call a constitutional pressure campaign." He walked over to a map of California that showed dozens of red pins. These represent the locations where Alliance members live and work. When we launch a campaign, we coordinate simultaneous peaceful protests at multiple locations connected to the target company. Corporate headquarters, executive residences, board member offices, and major shareholders. Jessica added, "We also coordinate with patient advocacy groups, medical professionals who support pricing reform, and investors who are concerned about the ethical implications of pharmaceutical pricing. The goal is to create sustained, visible pressure that makes it clear the company is facing a significant public relations problem. "How long does this usually take?" Margaret asked. "It varies," Carmen replied. "The Harrison case took 6 days. The Morrison family in Arizona took 3 weeks. The longest campaign we've run lasted 2 months, but that was for a particularly stubborn company that eventually agreed to reduce their pricing by 70% for all patients. Not just one family." Margaret tried to imagine what Emma would think about motorcycles surrounding pharmaceutical company buildings on her behalf. Would she be proud that people were fighting for her, or would she be frightened by the attention and conflict? "I need to ask," Margaret said slowly, "is there any chance this could make things worse? Could the company retaliate somehow?" Jessica's expression became very serious. "That's always a risk, which is why we're extremely careful about how we operate. We never break laws, never threaten anyone, and never do anything that could be construed as harassment. Everything we do is protected speech and lawful assembly. But yes, some companies have tried to respond with legal challenges or by pressuring other organizations to withdraw support from families." "What happened in those cases?" "We have very good lawyers," Thunder said simply, "and we have a lot of experience dealing with corporate attempts at intimidation. No family we've worked with has ever been successfully sued or legally threatened by a pharmaceutical company." Margaret looked around the room at these people who had somehow become her allies, bikers and lawyers, engineers and journalists, all united by the belief that access to life-saving medication should not depend on a family's ability to pay. "There's something else you need to understand," Thunder said. "Once we start this process, it's going to change your life. Not just because we might succeed in getting Emma's medication, but because you're going to see how the system really works. You're going to meet other families going through the same thing, understand how pharmaceutical pricing affects millions of people, and probably feel obligated to keep fighting even after Emma gets what she needs." Margaret thought about the message from Sarah Kellerman, about her son Michael who had died at 9, about all the families who were facing the same impossible choice between bankruptcy and death. "If we do this," she said, "if we somehow get Helix to provide Emma's medication for free, would that help other families too?" "Every victory makes the next one easier," Carmen replied. "When companies see that other companies have been successfully pressured to provide compassionate care, they're more likely to agree to similar arrangements rather than face the same kind of public scrutiny." Thunder walked over to a whiteboard and drew a simple diagram. "Here's how we see it. Right now, pharmaceutical companies can charge whatever they want because most families either pay the price or die quietly. When families start fighting back publicly, when they refuse to die quietly, it changes the entire equation." Margaret stared at the diagram, understanding that she was being offered more than just help with Emma's medical costs. She was being offered the chance to join a movement that was challenging the fundamental assumptions of American healthcare. "I keep thinking about all the families who can't fight back," she said. "The ones who don't know about organizations like yours, or who are too sick or too poor, or too scared to make noise." "That's exactly why we do this work," Thunder replied. "Every family that fights back makes it a little easier for the next family. Every company that gets pressured into providing compassionate care sets a precedent that other companies have to consider." Margaret looked at Emma's photograph on her phone, her daughter grinning at the camera, unaware that her life had become a test case for whether American healthcare could be forced to prioritize people over profits. "When do we start?" The formal petition to Helix Therapeutics was a masterpiece of legal precision and emotional appeal. Jessica Brennan had crafted 12 pages that outlined Emma's medical condition, the family's financial situation, and the constitutional principles at stake when life-saving medication was priced beyond the reach of ordinary Americans. The document cited 17 Supreme Court cases, included detailed medical records, and concluded with a simple request: provide lonafarnib to Emma Chen at no cost under the company's compassionate use program. Margaret hand-delivered the petition to Helix's corporate headquarters in La Jolla, accompanied by Thunder and 2 other alliance members. The receptionist accepted the document with professional courtesy, promised it would be forwarded to the appropriate department, and provided a case number for tracking purposes. It was all very polite and bureaucratic, exactly what Margaret had expected from months of dealing with insurance companies and medical bureaucracies. They'll respond in exactly 13 days, Thunder predicted as they walked back to their motorcycles. These companies have standard procedures for everything, including how long to ignore requests that might cost them money. He was wrong. Helix responded in 11 days. The letter was signed by someone named Dr. Amanda Walsh, Director of Patient Access Programs, and it was a template that had clearly been used hundreds of times before. The company appreciated the Chen family's difficult situation and recognized the challenging financial burden that rare disease treatments could present. However, after careful review, Emma's case did not meet the criteria for the compassionate use program. The letter suggested that the family continue working with their insurance company and explore other financial assistance options that might be available through non-profit organizations. Margaret read the letter 3 times, each time feeling her anger build. Dr. Walsh had reduced Emma's life to a form rejection, a standard bureaucratic response that acknowledged their difficult situation while offering no actual help. The letter was polite, professional, and utterly heartless. "Time to make some noise," Thunder said when Margaret called to report the rejection. The Constitutional Health Alliance launched their campaign on a Wednesday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. 85 motorcycles converged on 5 different locations simultaneously: Helix's corporate headquarters in La Jolla, CEO Richard Blackstone's private residence in Rancho Santa Fe, the company's research facility in San Diego, the office of board chairman Victoria Sterling in Newport Beach, and the Los Angeles headquarters of Meridian Capital, Helix's largest institutional investor. Margaret had never seen anything like it. The alliance members arrived in perfect formation, their motorcycles gleaming in the morning sun, their leather vests displaying patches that identified them as veterans, teachers, business owners, and professionals. They carried signs that read, "Healthcare is a constitutional right. Emma Chen deserves to live," and Helix, "Choose people over profits." But what struck Margaret most was how organized and disciplined they were. Each location had a designated leader who ensured that protesters stayed on public property, maintained safe distances from buildings, and interacted respectfully with anyone who approached them. Jessica Brennan had stationed lawyers at each site to monitor for any legal issues, and Carmen Rodriguez coordinated with media outlets that had been alerted to cover the story. The response was immediate and dramatic. By 10 o'clock, local news crews were filming the protests. By noon, the story had been picked up by national cable networks. By evening, "It's Emma Deserves to Live" was trending on social media with over 50,000 posts sharing Margaret's story and demanding that Helix provide the medication. Margaret spent the day at the corporate headquarters, watching alliance members take turns speaking with reporters, explaining the constitutional principles behind their protest, and sharing stories about other families who had faced similar situations. She was amazed by how articulate and informed they were. These weren't angry bikers making vague demands, but citizens who understood the legal, economic, and moral complexities of pharmaceutical pricing. The First Amendment guarantees our right to petition the government for redress of grievances, Maria Santos explained to a CNN reporter. But when the government allows corporations to price life-saving medication beyond the reach of working families, we have the right to petition those corporations directly through peaceful protest. Thunder gave an interview that would later go viral on YouTube. "We're not asking Helix to give away their medication for free to everyone," he said, his voice calm and measured despite the chaos around him. "We're asking them to look at one 6-year-old girl who will die without this medication and decide whether their profit margin is worth her life. That's not a business decision, that's a moral choice." The most powerful moment came when Margaret herself was interviewed by a local news reporter. She had been terrified of speaking publicly, convinced that she would say something wrong or somehow damage Emma's case. But when the reporter asked her what she wanted people to understand about her situation, the words came easily. "I want people to understand that this could happen to any family," Margaret said, looking directly into the camera. "We have insurance. We work hard. We've never asked for anything from anyone. But when your child needs medication that costs $500,000 a year, none of that matters. The system isn't designed to help families like ours. It's designed to extract maximum profit from our desperation." The reporter asked if she was comfortable with the Alliance's aggressive tactics. Margaret looked around at the 85 people who had shown up to fight for her daughter's life. People who had taken time off work, traveled from other states, and risked arrest to support a family they had never met before. "These people aren't being aggressive," she said. "They're being American. They're exercising their constitutional rights to demand that corporations be held accountable for decisions that affect human lives. What's aggressive is pricing medication so high that children die because their parents can't afford to keep them alive." The protest continued for 3 days. Alliance members maintained their presence at all 5 locations around the clock, with shifts changing every 8 hours to ensure that someone was always there with signs, information, and stories about Emma and other families facing similar situations. The media coverage intensified rather than diminishing, with opinion pieces appearing in major newspapers, medical professionals issuing statements about pharmaceutical pricing, and politicians beginning to comment on the case. On Thursday evening, Margaret received a call that changed everything. "Mrs. Chen, this is Dr. Amanda Walsh from Helix Therapeutics. I'm calling regarding your daughter's case." Margaret's heart raced. Dr. Walsh was the same person who had signed the rejection letter just 5 days earlier. "I want to let you know that our medical review board has reconsidered Emma's case in light of some additional information that was brought to our attention. We've decided to approve her for our expanded access program, which will provide lonafarnib at no cost to your family." Margaret sat down heavily, feeling like her legs might give out. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. We'll need some additional paperwork from your physician, but we can have the medication delivered to your doctor's office within 48 hours of receiving the completed forms." After hanging up the phone, Margaret sat in her kitchen for 10 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Emma was upstairs playing quietly in her room, unaware that her life had just been saved by 85 bikers who believed that healthcare was a constitutional right. But the victory felt incomplete. Margaret called Thunder to share the news, expecting celebration and relief. Instead, his response surprised her. "That's great news for Emma," he said. "Now we need to talk about what comes next." "What do you mean?" "I mean, this can't be a one-time thing. Helix agreed to help Emma because we made it more expensive for them to refuse than to comply. But there are hundreds of other families facing the same situation with the same company and dozens of other companies using the same pricing strategies. Are you willing to keep fighting?" Margaret looked out her kitchen window at the suburban street where Emma would now grow up, attend school, and hopefully live to adulthood. She thought about Sarah Kellerman's son, Michael, about all the families who were still waiting for help, about the fundamental injustice of a system that allowed children to die from treatable conditions. What would that look like? It would mean becoming a spokesperson for pharmaceutical pricing reform, speaking at congressional hearings, supporting other families going through what you just experienced, and helping us pressure other companies to adopt more reasonable pricing policies. Emma's case proved that public pressure works, but only if we're willing to keep applying it. Over the following weeks, Margaret discovered that Thunder had been right about how the experience would change her. She found herself researching healthcare policy, learning about Medicare for all proposals, and connecting with advocacy organizations that she had never known existed. Emma's successful case had generated dozens of calls from other families facing similar situations, and Margaret felt obligated to help them navigate the system that had nearly killed her daughter. 3 months later, Margaret testified before a Senate subcommittee on healthcare pricing, sitting at a witness table alongside Thunder, Jessica, and representatives from pharmaceutical companies. She wore the same conservative business suit she had worn to her first meeting with the Alliance. But everything else about her had changed. Senators, she said, looking at the panel of legislators who would decide whether to support pricing reform legislation. I want you to understand that my daughter Emma is alive today not because the system worked, but because 85 Americans on motorcycles forced it to work. That's not how healthcare should function in the wealthiest nation in the world, the pharmaceutical industry. Representatives argued that pricing restrictions would stifle innovation and reduce incentives for developing new treatments. Margaret listened to their presentations about research costs and market forces, then responded with numbers she had learned from Jessica and Maria. Helix Therapeutics spent more money on executive bonuses last year than they did on research and development, she said. Their CEO's yacht cost enough money to provide free medication to almost 200 children like Emma. This isn't about innovation, it's about greed. The hearing generated significant media attention, but Margaret had learned not to expect immediate results from the political process. Real change, she had discovered, came from sustained pressure applied by people who refused to accept the status quo. 6 months after Emma received her first dose of lonafarnib, Margaret had become a full-time advocate for healthcare reform. She worked with the Constitutional Health Alliance to support other families, testified at legislative hearings, and spoke at rallies across the country. Emma, meanwhile, was responding well to treatment. Her condition had stabilized, and she was able to participate in activities that had been impossible before. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Margaret understood her role as a citizen. She had learned that democracy wasn't something that happened to her. It was something she had to actively participate in creating. The bikers who had saved Emma's life had taught her that constitutional rights were meaningless unless people were willing to exercise them, even when doing so was uncomfortable or inconvenient. The final victory came almost a year after the initial protest, when Helix Therapeutics announced a new pricing policy for rare disease medications. Under pressure from congressional investigations, investor concerns, and ongoing advocacy campaigns, the company agreed to provide free medications to any family earning less than 400% of the federal poverty level and to cap annual out-of-pocket costs at $10,000 for all other families. The announcement was covered extensively in the media, with most reports crediting sustained advocacy pressure from organizations like the Constitutional Health Alliance. Margaret was quoted in the New York Times, describing the policy change as proof that corporate behavior could be changed when citizens refused to accept unacceptable outcomes. But for Margaret, the most meaningful moment came during a quiet evening at home, when Emma asked her why people had been protesting to help her get medicine. Because sometimes, Margaret explained, when the rules aren't fair, good people have to work together to change them, and sometimes the people who help you aren't the ones you expect. Emma considered this for a moment, then asked, "Are you going to keep helping other people change unfair rules?" Margaret looked at her daughter, alive, healthy, and curious about the world around her, and realized that Emma had understood something important about what had happened to their family. "Yes," Margaret said. "I think that's exactly what I'm going to do." The Constitutional Health Alliance had given Emma her life back, but they had given Margaret something equally valuable: The understanding that ordinary citizens could challenge powerful institutions and win, as long as they were willing to work together and refuse to give up. In America, healthcare had become a constitutional right, not because politicians had decided it should be, but because 85 bikers had decided that a 6-year-old girl deserved to live, and they had been willing to make enough noise to ensure that the people in power couldn't ignore her any longer. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.